Hey, Pastor, what did Jesus mean when he said, I must hate my father and mother in Luke 14?
That's a passage that can be very confusing when you first read it. And the reason I think it's confusing is because it almost seems to be a contradiction as to what the Bible teaches. We know in Exodus 20, one of the Ten Commandments obviously is to honor your father and mother. Well, how can you honor your father and mother and hate them at the same time?
Right.
And then Proverbs 20:20 says that if someone were to curse their mother and father, that their light would go out in a dark place. That's pretty descriptive. And so, it honors mother and father. And then Jesus comes along and says, well, unless you hate your mother and father.
Right.
So it almost seems a contradiction. Is God contradicting himself in what he says? And but you got to understand that it was said in a way of a comparison, where Jesus wasn't actually saying that you are to literally, emotionally and physically hate your mother and father. He was making the point of what it takes to be a follower of his. And he was basically, in essence, saying that your dedication, devotion, and commitment to him must so far exceed any other relationship that it almost would seem love and hate, love versus hate.
Okay.
So obviously not really saying you've got to hate your mom and dad,
Right.
But saying that, your devotion to Christ must come first. And, and the way that fleshes itself out in real living is sometimes we do have relationships that are broken with family or friends or even coworkers because they cannot accept our devotion to Christ. And so that it does certainly affect relationships of those who can't accept that. But it still doesn't mean we literally physically hate someone. It's just a comparison.
So is that something that, do we see that a lot in Scripture? It almost seems as if Jesus in this case is speaking like in an idiom. For instance, if it's raining outside and I say it's raining cats and dogs, I don't literally mean
Exactly.
There's cats and dogs falling from the sky. Is that kind of what we're seeing here?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we're seeing. And I think that in the way that he put it in that day, I think they certainly, for the most part, understood that he was using a play on words there, or as you said, an idiom. I don't think that they thought he was really telling them to hate mother and father.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, this comparison would be somewhat different than when Jesus told them that to be his followers, they must eat of his flesh or drink of his blood. And I think they did misunderstand that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think they were trying to figure out, well, how do we do that? And why would we have to do that to be followers? And they didn't really understand that. But I think in this case, they understood that he was making a comparison. Even though I'm not sure that they felt like they could do that at that point, but I think they understood it was a comparison. So, obviously God is never going to contradict himself.
Yeah.
And, when we read the Bible, I think we have to face the Bible with that conclusion that God is not one to lie. He's not one to contradict himself. And so rather than reading that and going, aha, I found a contradiction, I read that and I go, okay, that seems like a contradiction, but I don't believe it really is because God doesn't contradict himself. So I need to dig in and find out.
Yeah, I think one of the things whenever I find myself reading in Scripture and I find a quote-unquote contradiction or something that just kind of stumps me for a little bit, one of the things I find myself asking is, okay, Thomas, you're definitely not the first person who's stumped upon this. So I highly doubt that this dismantles something, the Christian faith.
Right. Right.
So when I see stuff like this, I think I would ask myself, surely somebody else has run into this. Why has this not disrupted Christianity entirely?
Right.
And do a little bit extra digging. But so what you're saying, though, just so I understand correctly, is this isn't a call to literally hate your family.
Right.
It's just a call to basically live in almost like abandonment to any sort of earthly relationship you may have for God's kingdom instead, right?
Yeah, I think he's saying that that's something you've got to be willing to lay on the table.
Right.
To any other relationship has to be submissive to your relationship with Christ.
Okay.
Kind of the same as when Jesus said, "Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me." I don't think he meant the disciples were all to go out and get a wooden cross and carry it
Right.
everywhere they went, but they understood that cross was an instrument of death and sacrifice. And so he was saying, if you're going to follow me, you've got to be willing to live a life of sacrifice.
Or if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off.
Cut it off.
We're not calling for self-mutilation.
Yeah, he wasn't
Okay.
calling for mutilation of your body, but to make the emphasis of how our devotion must be to Christ.
Okay, that makes sense. Awesome. Hey everyone, thanks again for joining us for another episode of Hey Pastor. If you have a question about the Bible, theology, or even day-to-day Christianity, email it to us at podcast@fellowshipchapel.us. Again, that's podcast@fellowshipchapel.us. Your question may be on a future episode. Thanks again for joining us. We hope to see you again next week. And remember that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life.